The wind howled across the brittle prairie, kicking up dust that clung to everything like sorrow that wouldn't let go. Clara Dawson pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped down the cracked road leading into Granger's. Hollow, a town more ghost than living. Her boots were thin, her stomach hollow, and her hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of what she was about to do. Behind her, in a crumbling shack on the edge of town, her mother lay sick and fading. Margaret Dawson had once been the strongest woman Clara had ever known, raising her alone, running a small boarding house after her husband died in a cattle accident. But time and hardship had worn her down. The last few weeks had seen her coughing blood, feverish and weak. The doctor had come once, taken one look at the threadbare room, and said, "Medicine costs coin. You've got none." He hadn't returned that Clara had tried everything. Cleaning houses for pennies, mending shirts, baking what little she could. From the flour she managed to scrape together. Nothing was enough. No one had room for more charity. And now her mother's fever had spiked again. She only had one thing left to give, herself. Her eyes scanned the town as she reached the wooden planks of the main street, weathered storefronts sagging in the sun, shutters clapping in the wind. The saloon doors creaked. The general store clerk eyed her like she was trouble. But Clara didn't stop. She went to each home, each shop, knocked, pleaded. "I can cook, clean, take care of children. I'll work for nothing, just a place for my mother to rest, some medicine, please." But doors were closed in her face, eyes looking through her as if she didn't exist. Hours passed. Her voice grew hoarse. The sun dipped lower. Dust settled on her skirts like ash. She was walking away from the last house on the row when a ranch hand spit near her feet and said, "Try the big house up the hill. That man's got more land than sense." Clara turned. At the edge of the horizon, just past the tree line, stood a house larger than anything else around, flanked by barns and quiet pastures. It looked untouched by the town's decay, like it didn't belong to this place at all. With her last bit of strength, she trudged toward it. The house was quiet, its porch wide, shaded. She knocked, once, twice. Just as she was about to leave, the door opened. A tall man stood before her broad shoulders, streaks of silver in his dark hair and eyes that didn't flinch. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't scowl or leer like the others. He just waited. Clara took a breath. "My name is Clara Dawson. My mother's dying. I have no money, no family. I'm asking if you'll take me in as a servant. I'll work dawn to dusk for food and a bed. I only need enough to get medicine for her." The silence between them was heavy. The man looked her over, not in the way men usually did, but with a quiet calculation, like he was measuring her soul. Then, finally, he said, "No." Clara's shoulders slumped. Her mouth opened to plead again, but he held up a hand. "You're no one's servant in my house," he said firmly. "No one's property here." She blinked. He stepped back. "Get your mother. You'll both stay here. Room upstairs. I'll send for Doc Whitmore." "Wait, what? Why would you?" "Because someone should have helped you long before. You got here," he said simply, "and I got no use for pride when it stands in the way of doing right." Clara stood frozen. For the first time in weeks, she couldn't find words. Her heart beat wildly, not with fear, but with something dangerously close to hope. "Go on," he said, nodding toward the road. "You can come back with her, or I'll fetch her myself. Either way, she's not dying in that shack." Clara turned and stumbled back down the hill, stunned. She didn't even know the man's name, but for the first time in weeks, her footsteps felt lighter. He didn't want a servant, he wanted to help, and that changed everything. Clara's legs burned. As she half ran, half stumbled back toward the edge of town, heart thudding like a war drum. Her arms ached from carrying her mother so far already, and she hadn't eaten in over a day. But none of that mattered. The man in the big house, whoever he was, had said yes. Or rather, he'd said, "Not in my house," in a way that shook her more than any door slam or harsh word from earlier that day. It was the first time someone hadn't looked through her or past her, but directly at her. Like she mattered. By the time she reached their shack, dusk was settling over the plains, painting the sky in copper and blood. Inside, the air was thick with heat and the sour scent of illness. Her mother lay curled in the cot, lips cracked, breathing shallow. Clara knelt beside her, brushing damp hair from her forehead. "Ma," she whispered, "we're leaving." "You're coming with me." Margaret stirred. "Where?" "Somewhere safe," Clara promised, wrapping a thin blanket around her mother's frail body and hoisting her over her shoulder with a strength born of desperation. It took over an hour to walk the mile back to the ranch house. By the time she reached the gates, sweat soaked Clara's dress, her arms trembled, and every step felt like lifting stones. She wasn't sure how she made it up the steps, but the front door opened before she could knock. The man stood there, again, lantern in hand. He took one look at her and immediately stepped forward, taking Margaret from her arms like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I've got her," he said. "Come on, inside." Clara followed them into the house, warm, dimly lit, smelling faintly of wood smoke and leather. The parlor had worn rugs, a tall bookshelf, and a stone hearth that still held heat from the day's fire. The man moved with surprising gentleness, laying Margaret on a feather mattress in a small guest room off the main hall. "She needs water," Clara said urgently. "And broth." "I can make some. I already put something on the stove," he replied. "You what?" "I figured you'd come back," he said simply, brushing sweat from his brow. "Doctor's on his way. He owes me more than a few favors." Clara blinked, not sure whether to cry, thank him, or collapse on the spot. He looked at her again, closer now. "When's the last time you ate?" "I'm fine. You're not." His voice was calm, but firm. "Sit down before you fall down." Clara didn't argue. She sank into the chair near the hearth, her head buzzing. Within minutes, he handed her a bowl of warm broth and a hunk of dry bread. It tasted like mercy. Only after she'd eaten did she gathered the courage to ask, "What's your name?" He looked at her for a moment, as if remembering how to answer. "James Rourke." She turned the name over in her mind. It sounded vaguely familiar. Maybe she'd heard it around town. Always said in hushed tones. The reclusive rancher on the hill, the one who kept to himself. Some said he was mad. Others said he was dangerous. But the man who had taken her and her mother in without question didn't seem like either. "You live alone?" she asked, careful. "For a while now." "Why did you help me?" James shrugged. "Because no one else did." That ain't right. Simple words. But they undid her. No one had helped her since her father died. No one had stood between her and the cold edge of the world. Until now. Clara glanced toward the bedroom where her mother now rested in a real bed. Her throat tightened. "You can stay here," James said quietly, watching her, "as long as you need. No debts, no deals. This is my home, but it won't be anyone's prison." She stared at him, searching for a catch, a shadow, anything that would make this feel like a trick. But all she saw was a man standing quietly beside the fire, carrying more silence than threat. "I can help," she said softly. "Around the ranch, I can work." "You're welcome to," he replied, "but not because you owe me." Clara didn't know what to say. She only nodded. That night, while her mother slept in clean sheets and she lay on a cot softer than anything she'd touched in years, Clara tried to believe it was real. For the first time in forever, someone had opened a door and left it open. Morning light filtered in through clean cotton curtains, so different from the threadbare, soot-stained rags Clara was used to. She stirred from the cot in the small room next to her mother's, stretching slowly, muscles still sore from carrying. Margaret the night before. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The scent of coffee, wood smoke, and fresh bread reminded her. James Rourke's ranch. The house on the hill. Clara sat up fast and padded to her mother's door. Margaret was still sleeping, her breathing steadier than the day before. Someone had cleaned her face, changed the damp rags on her forehead, and placed a glass of cool water on the knit stand. Clara blinked at the quiet grace of it. She crept down the stairs barefoot. The kitchen was already humming. James stood at the stove, sleeves rolled up, frying eggs like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. He looked up and nodded. "Morning. You? Cook? I eat, don't I?" he said, deadpan, sliding eggs onto a plate. Clara hesitated. "Where I come from, men don't cook unless they've lost a bet." He half smiled. "Around here, if something needs doing, you do it." He placed a plate in front of her and gestured toward a chair. Clara sat slowly, unsure. She took a bite, then another. The eggs were simple but warm, seasoned just right. It almost made her tear up. How normal it tasted. James poured coffee. "Margaret's doing better. Fever's not gone, but the doc said she's strong." Clara let out a breath she'd been holding for days. "Thank you, again." James leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "This house has rules," he said plainly, "and I figure it's best you hear them." Her fork paused mid-air. "You're welcome here. That means no sneaking off in the night to repay kindness. I've seen too many proud folks turn charity into shame. I wasn't planning to." He held up a hand. "Not accusing, just saying, if you want to help, help. I've got chores to fill a calendar. But you work because you want to, not because you owe me." Clara nodded slowly, uncertain whether to feel relieved or insulted. She'd always paid her way, always earned her keep. But here, she wasn't even allowed to do that? And theirs. "One more thing," James added. "No one around here's better than anyone else. Not because they've got money. Not because they've got land, and not because they're a man." Clara arched an eyebrow. "You really think that?" "I know it." She studied him, trying to make sense of this quiet, strange man. "Most men I've met talk like they believe it. Then they show you different when no one's looking." James met her gaze. "Then they aren't men, just boys in boots." That silenced her. After breakfast, she insisted on washing the dishes despite James's protest. He eventually let her, shaking his head and muttering something about stubborn women. The moment felt normal, like life before everything got hard. Later, James took her on a slow walk around the property. The ranch stretched farther than she could have imagined. Open fields, a chicken coop, stables, and a fenced-off section with growing crops. It wasn't the biggest spread in the territory, but it was cared for. Alive. "You keep all this by yourself?" she asked. "Mostly. A couple hands come by when I need fence mending or branding done. Otherwise, just me and the land." Clara looked out across the fields, the breeze catching her hair. "It's quiet. I like quiet." "So do I," she said softly. They paused near the barn, where a pair of horses swished their tails lazily in the sun. James pointed. "That one's Clara's now if she wants to learn to ride." She blinked. "You're giving me a horse?" "Loaning it. You'll need to earn your saddle if you want to keep it." A grin tugged at her lips. "Fair." That afternoon, Clara checked on her mother again and changed the bedding. Margaret stirred and gave her a tired smile. "He seems kind." Clara nodded. "I don't know what to make of him." "Sometimes people surprise you," Margaret murmured. "Sometimes they're exactly what they seem." As night fell and Clara helped James stack firewood on the porch, the rules of the house felt clearer, not just chores and expectations, but something deeper. Respect, dignity, balance. She wasn't a servant here, not because he wouldn't let her be one, but because for the first time in a long while, she didn't have to be. The days that followed unfolded slowly, like dawn stretching across the plains. Clara settled into a rhythm she hadn't known. She missed early mornings beside her mother, followed by chores James insisted weren't required but never stopped her from doing. She fed chickens, swept the porch, even learned to crack a lasso. Under the wide blue sky, her mother grew stronger by the hour. The fever hadn't fully broken, but Margaret's cheeks were no longer gray, her cough less ragged. Every time Clara brought her warm broth or helped her to the wash basin, Margaret would whisper, "That man is either a saint or a mystery." Clara had no argument that James Rourke was kind, but distant. He didn't ask about her past, didn't press her to explain how a girl her age had learned to carry a grown woman half a mile on foot. But when Clara offered her help, he didn't condescend either. Just nodded and handed her gloves. Still, Clara couldn't shake the sense that this house held shadows. Late one afternoon, she was dusting in the parlor while James repaired a saddle out back. A draft had snuck in through a cracked window, rustling. A stack of papers on the corner desk. As she reached to smooth them, something slipped out and landed on the floor. It was a photograph, faded and curling at the edges. The image showed a woman with soft features and strong eyes holding a small boy on her lap. They were seated in front of the very fireplace Clara now stood beside. The woman wore a high-collared dress and a steady, almost defiant gaze. The boy had James's JAWLINE. Clara turned the photo over. No names, just the number 1866 written in faint pencil. A cold wave moved through her chest. She shouldn't have looked. She knew that. But something about the way the woman stared into the lens, like she'd known her life would be cut short, held Clara in place. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. Clara spun. James stood in the doorway, hands dusty from leatherwork, one brow raised. "I didn't mean to snoop," she said quickly, placing the photograph on the desk. It fell. The wind. He stepped forward and picked up the photo, dusting it off silently. "She was your wife?" Clara asked carefully. James stared at the image for a long moment. Her name was Annie. "And the boy?" "My son, Daniel." The room felt colder. "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the photo. "She died after the war. Pneumonia. Took Daniel with her a few weeks later." Clara's throat tightened. She thought of the nights she had lain awake listening to her mother cough, terrified she'd hear nothing the next morning. "I didn't mean to pry," she said again. James set the photograph down gently, like it was something sacred. "You're not prying, just asking." Clara sat down slowly in the nearby chair. "You never remarried?" "No." "Didn't want to?" His jaw shifted. "Didn't think I deserved to." The weight of those words landed hard. Clara recognized the way he said them, not with bitterness, but with resignation. As if he'd accepted guilt as a permanent companion. "What happened?" she asked, surprised by her own voice. James sat across from her, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. The fire crackled between them. "I was gone longer than I should have been. War dragged out, and I took jobs after jobs that paid in gold, not peace. By the time I came home, she was sick. I thought I could fix it with money, medicine, but it was too late." He looked at the fire like he expected to find her ghost. "In it, she forgave me," he added quietly, "but I never did." Clara wanted to say something, some thread of comfort, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she reached forward and placed her hand on his. Just for a moment, she must have. "Loved you," she said. He didn't pull away. "She did," he said. "More than I earned." They sat in silence, hand to hand, across a space that didn't feel so wide anymore. Outside, the wind had settled. Inside, something had shifted. Clara didn't know what would come next, whether she would stay or go, whether the house on the hill would remain a safe place or become something more. But she knew one thing for sure. James Rourke was a man with ghosts, and she, perhaps, was learning to live with her own. By the end of the second week, the lines between guest and partner had begun to blur. Clara rose early each morning, not out of obligation, but habit. She fed the hens, fetched water, swept the porch, and checked on her mother, whose strength was returning day by day. Margaret now sat up on her own and even asked Clara to read aloud when the evenings were long and quiet. James had stopped telling her to take it easy. After the third morning, he found her elbow deep in soapsuds and singing under her breath. I don't work, I stew," Clara had said, drying her hands on her apron. James just nodded. "Then we'll both get more done." Their unspoken agreement grew from there. When James fixed fencing on the west pasture, Clara followed with pliers and wire. When she cleaned out the chicken coop, James stood nearby patching the shed roof, tossing her small smiles between hammer swings. Neither one spoke much, but the silence was never heavy. It was working silence, COMPANIONABLE. And slowly, trust began to sprout like the early green shoots Clara found pushing up through the dry soil in the garden. One afternoon, James called her to the barn with a surprising offer. "You ever ride before?" Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "Only once, bareback. The horse spooked, and I fell straight into a prickly pear." He smirked. "Well, let's try with a saddle this time." He let out a gentle mare named Maple, sorrel-colored, with white socks and an easy gait. Clara's eyes lit up as she patted the horse's nose. "She's beautiful. She's patient. Which you'll need, since your form's going to be terrible at first," he added, grinning slightly. Clara rolled her eyes. "Appreciate the confidence." He showed her how to saddle up, tighten the cinch, and mount properly. When she faltered, he steadied her with a hand to her waist, brief contact, but enough to send a rush through her chest she pretended not to notice. She wobbled at first, clutching the reins like they were live wires. "Relax your back," he said. "She can feel every fear in your spine." Clara took a breath and followed his lead. Maple walked a slow circle. By the second lap, Clara was grinning. "You're a natural," James called. "You say that now, wait till I fall off again." She didn't. She rode every morning after that, building skill and confidence. James watched from the fence, offering tips, then challenges. Ride bareback, trot through the orchard, chase after the goats when they broke loose, again. Laughter became more common than words between them. The house, too, began to feel like more than shelter. Clara started planting fresh herbs by the windows. She hung laundered sheets on the line without asking. She organized the pantry and labeled the jars. James never commented, but she caught him standing in the doorway once, arms folded, just watching her with that unreadable look of his. "Something wrong?" she asked. "No," he said. "Just forgot what it looked like, someone making this place feel lived in." The words lingered longer than she expected. That evening, they sat on the porch steps, drinking coffee while the sky turned from peach to lavender. James broke the silence. "You planning to leave when your mother's better?" Clara blinked. "Is that you asking me to?" "No," he said quickly. "Just wondering if you already made up your mind." Clara looked out over the quiet fields. The breeze played with the edge of her skirt. "I hadn't thought about it. For the first time in months, I'm not looking for the next thing." James nodded. "It's not much of a life, this place. Lonely, quiet." She turned to him. "It's the first place I've felt safe in a long time. That counts for something." They sat like that, the silence full, not empty. Then James stood and offered his hand. "Come on." We've got a fence to finish tomorrow." Clara took his hand and rose, steadying herself beside him. She didn't know exactly what was growing between them, but it was real, and it was steady, like the roots of something that didn't bloom all at once, but would hold strong if given time. The summer air turned heavy that week, humid and thick with a stillness that made Clara uneasy. The sky stayed cloudless, yet the wind changed. Something in it whispered of trouble. Clara noticed her mother coughing more again, not as violently as before, but with a deep rattle that set off alarms in her heart. Margaret had insisted it was just the night air, said the change in weather often stirred up old bones. But Clara could see her fading against subtle things, the glassy eyes, the lack of appetite, the slowness of her words. One morning Clara brought her breakfast and found the blanket soaked through with sweat. "Ma?" she whispered. Margaret's eyes fluttered open. Her lips were cracked. "Just tired, honey. I'll be all right." Clara didn't believe her. She brought in James, who gently took Margaret's temperature. The line between rancher and caretaker blurred again. His expression gave away more than his words. "She's burning up," he said quietly. "This isn't just exhaustion." "She was getting better," Clara murmured, panic creeping into her voice. "She was eating, talking. This doesn't make sense." "Fevers don't ask permission," James sighed, rising. "I'll send word to Doc Whitmore." But by sunset, there was no sign of the doctor. James returned from town with a tight jaw and anger simmering beneath his usually calm voice. "He's not coming," he told Clara. "Said he's overbooked. Claimed there's a stomach flu sweeping through a settlement east of here." Clara stared at him. "That's a lie." James nodded once. "Most likely." The truth was clear. Whitmore had never liked James, and now, with gossip running wild about the young woman and her sick mother living at the reclusive rancher's place, the town had found its excuse to turn away. Again, Clara stood, fists clenched. "Then I'll go. I'll find him and drag him here if I have to." "You'll do no such thing," James said, blocking the door. Clara's voice broke. "She's all I have, James." His expression softened. "I know. Which is why I'm not letting you run into a town full of cowards who already slammed their doors in your face." "Then what do? "We treat it ourselves," he said. "We've got quinine, willow bark tea, cool compresses. It's not everything, but it's something." So for the next 2 days they worked side by side, James fetching water, Clara cleaning cloths, her hands trembling as she wrung them out and placed them on her mother's chest and forehead. Margaret drifted in and out of fever dreams, murmuring names Clara didn't recognize, her voice sometimes sharp, sometimes whispering like wind. At night, Clara sat beside her with her head bowed, James nearby with his hand on her back. Neither said much, but the quiet offered strength. By the 3rd day, the fever still hadn't broken. Clara hadn't slept. Her eyes were bloodshot, her breath shallow. James tried to convince her to rest, but she wouldn't budge. "She dies, and I've got nothing left," Clara said flatly. James looked at her for a long moment. "You won't lose her. But if you run yourself ragged, she won't have you either." She wiped a tear from her cheek, pretending it was sweat. "I can't do this without a real doctor." "You're doing it now." "No," Clara said. "You are." He didn't argue, just handed her a fresh basin of water and knelt beside her again. On the 4th morning, Clara awoke with her head resting on the edge of her mother's bed. The room was quiet, still, too still. Her breath caught in her throat as she sat up. Then she saw it, Margaret's chest rising and falling, slow but steady. Her eyes fluttered open, clear, focused. "Clara," she croaked. "Water?" Clara nearly sobbed with relief as she reached for the cup, her hands shaking. James stepped into the doorway then, silent as always, but the look in his eyes said everything. The fever had broken. Later, when Margaret was asleep again, Clara found James outside by the barn, sharpening a blade for fence repair. She walked up behind him and stood quietly until he looked over. "I owe you everything," she said. "You don't owe me a thing," he replied. Clara swallowed hard. "You saved her. You saved me." James met her gaze. "No, Clara, you did that. I just stood next to you while you refused to give up." Something changed between them in that moment, not just gratitude, but something deeper, something that held weight. And neither one said another word. The days following Margaret's recovery felt like the ranch had been given a second breath. Clara had a lightness to her step again, humming as she swept the porch, tending the new sprigs in the garden, even laughing when the goats got into the laundry. Margaret sat upright now, crocheting by the window and watching the world outside like she hadn't in years. James, too, seemed to relax. He stopped hovering in the shadows and started showing Clara the finer parts of the ranch's workings: how to oil a saddle properly, how to spot storm signs in the sky, how to take apart a rifle and clean it in under 5 minutes. They worked as equals now. The air between them was full of quiet respect and something warmer that neither dared name aloud. But that peace didn't last. One afternoon, as Clara was hauling buckets from the well, she heard the distant beat of hooves. Not the slow rhythm of a ranch horse, but something sharper, fast, intentional. She looked up from the path just as a rider crested the hill near the barn, a tall man on a dark horse, dusty, worn, and riding like he didn't care who saw him. Coming, James stepped out of the barn a moment later. His body tensed as soon as he saw the man, though his face stayed calm. The rider dismounted in a fluid motion, pulling off his hat to reveal a head of black, sweat-slick hair streaked with gray. His eyes were cold and sharp as flint. "Well, hell," he said, smirking. "Didn't think you were still alive, Rourke." "Elias Monroe," James replied evenly. "You've got nerve showing up here. That's the first thing you say to the man who dragged you off the battlefield with half your ribs showing. You were late that day, too, if I recall." James muttered. Clara stayed frozen on the path, the bucket still in her hand. She watched as the two men eyed each other, old war comrades, maybe more, with a history too heavy to be unpacked in one breath. James finally turned and called out, "Clara, this is Elias Monroe. He and I go back farther than I like to admit." Elias glanced at her. His eyes lingered too long. "Didn't know you were keeping company these days." Clara didn't smile. "I live here. My mother and I both." Elias raised a brow. "That so? Well, I'll be damned. Rourke with a house full of women. Never thought I'd live to see it." James stepped between them just slightly. Not obvious. But Clara noticed. "What do you want, Elias?" James asked. Elias reached into his coat and tossed a folded letter onto the porch. "Word came down from Kansas. Land agents are sniffing around. Surveyors, too. They've been buying up ranches east of here. Yours'll be next." James didn't even blink. "Let them try. They're not asking, Rourke. They're taking. Anyone who resists ends up missing or burned out. I figured I'd warn you before you wake up with a torch at your door." Clara felt a chill crawl up her spine. Why warn him at all? She asked. Elias looked at her again, more serious now. "Because despite all the years and all the blood, your man here was the only one who didn't leave me behind when it counted. And because this land's more than dirt to him. He buried something here." James tensed, just slightly. Elias smirked. "Don't worry," he said. "I won't tell her about Annie. That's your ghost to carry." Clara stepped forward. "I already know about Annie." Elias tilted his head. "Do you now? Then maybe this one's got more backbone than the rest." Clara held his stare. "Or maybe I just know a good man when I see one." "For a beat, no." One said a word. Then Elias nodded once and remounted. "Keep your rifle loaded, Rourke," he said over his shoulder. and watch the shadows. They're not all ghosts anymore." Then he was gone. Clara turned to James as the dust settled. "What was that all about?" James sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "That was the past. Coming to make sure. I hadn't forgotten it. Are you going to tell me more?" He looked at her, something unreadable in his gaze. "I will, just not tonight." Clara didn't press him, but she knew, deep down, that whatever was buried on this land, memories, guilt, or danger, it wasn't done with them yet. For a few uneasy days after Elias Monroe's visit, the air around the ranch seemed to shift. It wasn't something Clara could see, but she could feel it. James began double-checking the locks at night. He moved his rifle from the barn to just beside the front door. Every time a rider passed on the road below, he stood a little taller. On the porch, watching with a soldier's eye, Clara didn't question it. Elias's warning had stirred something in James, and it stirred something in her, too. This ranch, this peaceful corner of a harsh world, had become more than just shelter for her and her mother. It was home. And now, that home felt like it was being circled by wolves. It came to a head 3 nights later. The evening started quiet. Clara sat on the porch swing beside her mother, both wrapped in quilts. James had gone to the south pasture to check a section of weakened fencing. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when Clara smelled it. Smoke, not the kind from the chimney, or a neighbor's fire down in the valley. This was different, sharper, faster. Clara rose, heart thudding. "Ma, go inside now." Margaret, slower but alert, did as she was told without protest. Clara grabbed the rifle James had left leaning by the door and raced toward the hill behind. The barn. From the ridge she saw it, flames curling along the north field, right where the dry brush had grown thickest. Someone had set it on purpose. No lightning, no accidents. The fire spread fast like it had helped. James appeared at her side seconds later, breathing hard, eyes locked on the blaze. "They lit it from the back fence," he said grimly, "trying to force the flames toward the house." Clara looked at him, fear rising in her chest. "What do we do?" He scanned the horizon. "We fight it." And fight they did. For hours, James and Clara worked side by side. They used shovels, wet sacks, and buckets to dig fire breaks and stamp down burning grass. James soaked burlap in the horse trough and wrapped it around Clara's shoulders. "If the wind shifts, run. Don't try to be brave." "I'm not leaving." "You," she snapped back. He gave her a quick look. "Then we do it together." By midnight, the worst of it was over. The flames had scorched the edge of the pasture, but thanks to James's quick work and Clara's grit, they'd stopped it from reaching the barn and the house. The smell of charred grass lingered in the air, thick and bitter. James stood over the smoldering remains, shirt soaked with sweat and ash on his face. "They meant for us to lose everything tonight." "Why?" Clara asked, voice hoarse. "What do they want?" James looked back at the ranch. Land, fear, the same things men have always wanted. She stepped closer. "You think it was those men Elias warned about?" He nodded. "They're testing the fences before they take the gate." That night, James kept his rifle beside his bed. Clara sat awake beside her mother's door, still wearing her soot-stained dress, her hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. But her heart was hard with something else. Resolved. By morning, townsfolk came to gawk. A few offered weak condolences. Most pretended to care, but none asked how they could help. But one thing became clear as the smoke cleared from the hills. Clara wasn't just a guest here anymore. She was a defender, a fighter, someone with something to lose. Later, as she helped, James boarded up the back fence. He turned to her and said, "Most people would have run last night." Clara met his eyes. "Most people didn't build their life here." He stared at her for a long time. Then, almost too soft to hear, he said, Neither did I not until you came. Clara's breath caught in her chest. The fire had nearly taken everything, but it also lit something that neither of them had dared to admit until now. They had something worth protecting, and maybe, just maybe, someone worth staying for. The morning after the fire, Clara stood in the pasture, barefoot, staring out at the blackened ridge. The land had burned hard, but not deep. Grass would grow again. That's what James had said anyway. But for Clara, something deeper had shifted, because now she wasn't just surviving. She was standing her ground. James found her there a little while later, holding a tin of nails and a hammer. You gonna patch the fence all by yourself? He asked. She didn't smile. If I have to. He walked up beside her and took the tin from her hands gently. You don't. You never do not hear. Clara looked at him, her throat tight. That's not what the world taught me. No, James said. But this ain't the world. It's our place, and in this place you're no one's servant. His words landed hard, not because they were new, but because she was finally ready to hear them. Not even yours? She asked quietly. James was quiet a moment. Especially. Not mine. Clara stared at him. Then what am I to you, James? He stepped closer. Close enough she could feel the warmth of him, smell the smoke still clinging to his shirt. You're the only reason this place feels alive again, Clara swallowed. So you saved me. Because you needed saving too? James's mouth twitched into something like a smile. Could be. For a long moment they stood in silence, surrounded by ash, smoke, and a strange kind of hope. Later that afternoon, Margaret insisted on being moved to the porch. She sat wrapped in a shawl, face tilted toward the sun, her eyes watching her daughter like she'd already seen what was coming. Clara brought her warm tea, placing it carefully into her hands. He loves you, you know, Margaret said softly, not even looking up. Clara blinked. He hasn't said. He doesn't need to. A man doesn't go running into fire for someone he thinks is just passing through. He built this house like a fortress, but you're the one who cracked the doors open. Clara lowered her gaze. It's not that simple. No, Margaret said. It never is. That's how you know it's real. That evening, Clara cooked dinner for all three of them, her mother at the table. James cleaning his rifle in the corner but watching her every move like he was memorizing the moment. When they ate, it was quiet, peaceful, and when Margaret retired early, James lingered. You ever think about what comes next? He asked. All the time, Clara said. He set his cup down, watching her hands as she wiped the table. I've been thinking about what this place could be. Not just a ranch, a real home, with real people in it. People who want to stay. Clara met his gaze. Are you asking me to stay? I'm saying you already have. I'm just waiting for you to stop waiting for someone to kick you out. She let the rag fall from her hand. I don't want to leave. James stepped toward her slowly, as if testing the ground between them. Then don't. The air shifted. Clara's pulse raced. And then she did something she hadn't dared. Since the day she walked up to his door, she reached for his hand. I offered myself to you once, she whispered. Desperate, broken. I thought the only value I had was in what I could give. James squeezed her hand. And I told you, you're no one's servant. Not then. Not now. Clara looked up at him. What am I now? His eyes softened. Someone I'd be proud to build a life with. It wasn't a proposal. Not yet. But it was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. And in that moment, under the low-hanging oil lamp in a quiet kitchen still scented with cornbread and cedarwood, Clara understood what had been growing between them all along. Not just shelter. Not just safety, but love. The kind built in hard places. The kind worth burning for. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it came all at once. The hills turned green seemingly overnight. And the wildflowers Clara thought the fire had killed returned, stubborn and defiant, blooming through charred earth like they had something to prove. Much like Clara herself, weeks had passed since this fire and since that quiet night when James told her he'd be proud to build a life with her. He hadn't pushed, hadn't made promises he couldn't keep, but the way he watched her now, eyes softer, smile easier, it was clear something between them had rooted deep. And for the first time in her life, Clara wasn't waiting for someone to change their mind or send her away. She was home. Margaret had returned to near full health. She spent her mornings on the porch shelling peas or darning socks, and her afternoons in the kitchen humming songs from her girlhood. She watched her daughter and James move through their days like two puzzle pieces that had finally been slid into place. "You know," she said one morning as Clara trimmed herbs by the window, "this house used to echo." Clara glanced at her. "You mean it was too quiet?" Margaret nodded. "Now it breathes." Clara didn't answer, but her fingers stilled over the mint leaves. She knew what her mother meant. The house had come alive not because of new furniture or clean windows, but because the people in it had chosen one another. That evening, James brought in a surprise. He placed a small wooden box on the table. Clara opened it cautiously and found a carefully folded deed inside. "To the East Field," James explained. "It's yours. To plant, to run, to do what you want. I'll register it in your name come Monday." Clara stared at the paper, her throat tightening. "You're giving me land? I'm not giving it to you," he said. "You earned it." She looked up at him. "This is more than kindness." James smiled faintly. "Yeah, it is." The next morning, she found him repairing a saddle on the porch and walked straight up to him, dust still on her apron and a breeze tugging loose strands of hair from her braid. "If I stay," she said, "I want more than a fence line." James set the leather down slowly and met her eyes. "What do you want?" "I want a say in how this place runs. I want to build something, not just live in it. I want to share it, not borrow it. And I want to do it beside someone who sees me for what I am, not just what I've been through." James stood then, without ceremony or speech. He pulled a small band of braided silver from his pocket. "I had this made by a blacksmith near Wichita a long time ago," he said. "Never knew who it was for. Now I do." Clara stared at the ring, stunned. "You?" He nodded. "No debts, no pressure. No strings, just choice." Clara didn't take it from him right away. Instead, she stepped closer and reached for his hand. "I spent so long thinking I had to be useful to be wanted," she whispered. "But you saw me as whole before I did." James's jaw tensed slightly, always more emotional than he liked to show, but his voice was steady. "You're not just wanted, Clara. You're needed." She slipped the ring onto her finger, not for what it meant, but for what it didn't mean. It wasn't a chain. It was a root. Later that night, Clara stood outside the house under a canopy of stars. The wind smelled like sage and smoke. Behind her, James was closing the barn. Her mother's soft laughter drifted through the open window. The girl who once offered herself in desperation now stood on land that was hers, in a home that was theirs, with a man who had never asked her to be anything but free, and that made all the difference.